Hey, it's Rebecca, and you're listening to the Hike Like a Woman podcast. This is the weekly show where we talk about all things adventure travel, and I give you a little glimpse into the behind the scenes here at Hike Like a Woman headquarters. Thanks for joining me and enjoy today's episode. I'm always just a little bit embarrassed when people say that they listen to the podcast because I will say that right now I really am focused on YouTube and building our YouTube channel and growing on YouTube just because I feel like people need to kind of see what our group trips look like before they book a trip. And I think that's the best way to like see and hear and see what goes on our group trips. And the podcast for me is just another way to connect with our community. I'm definitely over social media. I post every day on Facebook and Instagram, but it's not where I'm hanging out these days just because I find it to be somewhat distracting and it keeps me from what I'm really focused on. So right now I'm really focused on YouTube. I'm focused on making sure that our weekly newsletter goes out every single Monday. And I'm really focused on group trips and making sure that our trip participants are stoked and informed and ready to go on big adventures like the one that we just had in Iceland. And one of those adventures that you hear me talk about all the time, everywhere, is Mount Kilimanjaro. Kilimanjaro is definitely one of the biggest adventures I've ever been on in my entire life. And one thing that I think keeps people from climbing big mountains like Kilimanjaro is this fear of altitude and this uncertainty about altitude sickness and thinking, I'd hate to pay all that money to go all the way to Tanzania and do all this prep work to train for Mount Kilimanjaro just to show up and feel sick and not be able to enjoy the climb because of altitude sickness. And the truth is, we never really know how we are going to feel at altitude. On Kilimanjaro, I don't think I experienced any altitude sickness. I think I did definitely have a headache after we got off of the summit, which was a little strange, but I think it might have been more from just fatigue and dehydration than from altitude sickness. But in Peru, the moment my plane landed, I was sicker than a dog, and I was actually more acclimated for Peru than I was for Kilimanjaro because it was summer and I was up in the mountains and I live at 7,000 feet, but I was up, above 10,000 feet quite regularly. And a few days before I flew to Peru, I went to a Hike Like a Woman reunion with some trip participants from our Yellowstone trip. And I was at Breckenridge, which is a high altitude, for a few days. And I should have been very acclimated when I landed in Peru, but instead I was super sick for a couple days and just felt really lousy. So we never know how our body is going to feel. And it can vary by day, by location, what we're eating, what we're drinking. All of that really plays into altitude. Recently, I published a YouTube video about what your first night at altitude feels like, because I don't want people to be scared of altitude. I don't want you to miss out on incredible adventures because you're focused on altitude, or I don't want you to get to high altitude and assume that you're supposed to feel lousy just because you've been told that you're going to feel lousy at altitude. If you are one of those people that's like, I'd really love to go on a big adventure, but I don't know about altitude. I'm nervous about altitude sickness. I don't know how I'm going to feel at altitude. I would encourage you to head to our YouTube and check out our latest video all about altitude sickness and what your first night at altitude really feels like. And I'm going to give you some spoilers here. So if YouTube's not your thing, there are 5 things that I think really help me when I'm feeling the effects of altitude sickness. The first thing is time. So giving yourself time to acclimate to that higher elevation. I'm going to use Peru as an example because that's where I felt the worst. When we arrived in Cusco, which is, I think the elevation of Cusco is, I think it's high. I think it's like 11,000 feet or something. It's pretty high. when I arrived the next day, I went on a hike to Rainbow Mountain and we were above 15,000 feet, if not 16,000 feet. So I was already feeling lousy when we arrived in Peru. And then the next day, we went on this huge hike to big elevation. And it's no wonder that I felt lousy because I did not give myself time to acclimate. The next tip I have is food. When I'm at altitude, I tend to lose my appetite and it gets really hard to eat. And that is not good because we need to especially be eating at altitude. Things like protein are super important. And I found that if I can just get like a protein bar with some glucose in my stomach, it really helps a lot. There's these bars that I think they're called Build bars, BUILD. They're a protein bar. The company's in Utah. They're like the easiest protein bar for me to tolerate when I'm at altitude. The next thing I want to mention briefly is hydration, and hydration is important whether or not you're at altitude or not at altitude, but at altitude, it's especially important. Our guides on Kili were telling us 3, 4, 5 liters of fluids every single day, but also to make sure that you're getting some electrolytes in. Some Noon tablets are really good. I like Ultima electrolytes. But throwing in some electrolytes with your water, super important at altitude. Rest is my 4th tip at altitude. It's easy to push yourself a little bit too hard and your body is telling you to slow down at altitude because you're probably not feeling awesome. So it's okay to rest. And with that, if you find that you are giving yourself time, you're eating, you're drinking, you're getting electrolytes, you're resting, and you're still not feeling better, then just it's time to like head down the mountain. At that point, all of your fun tickets are taken. It's not fun anymore. So what's the point of having an outdoor adventure if it's not going to be fun? And the 5th tip that I have very briefly is to maybe talk to your physician about a prescription for Dimox. Dimox does have some side effects that are difficult for some people, but with Dimox, maybe try it at home before you use it on the mountain. And the side effects that I experienced from Dimox were increased urination, but it might have just been because I was trying so hard to make sure that I was drinking enough water. And then also I felt some tingling in my face and in my hands, which felt a little strange, but it also felt a little silly. And I didn't mind the tingling so much because I knew where it was coming from. I knew that it was a side effect from the Dimox. If I would have been at 19,000 feet and felt tingling in my fingers and my face and not known that it was a side effect from Dimox, I would have freaked out a little bit. So those are like 5 tips to help at altitude. And like I said, if you want to go check out our full video about what your first night at altitude really feels like, go check it out on YouTube. And thanks so much for being here, for hanging out with me. And I will be back next week talking a little bit more about our recent group trip to Iceland. Hey, if you've liked the show, I know you're going to love joining us for an upcoming group trip. Head on over to our website, hikelikewoman.com.